taught me nice. Ain't about winning, don't talk to me twice. I don't play dice, I'll make a move on the board, it's precise. The fuck is the price? I took a fiddle and dipped it in ice. I took a call.
And we back with another episode of the Rap Roll Pod with your boy Buck. Today I got one of my good homies on the show, Rob.
Thanks for having me, Buck.
From District Canna Concepts. For the people that aren't familiar with you, can you give them a little backstory on who you are and what your company is, what you do?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Robbie Martin. I've been in DC for about 9 years, from Atlanta originally, and have been involved in DC cannabis, mostly on the consumer side for a long time while I've lived up here. And then the last couple of years, like most people, have been going through the medical licensure process. Got an unlicensed operator license last November. First dispensary, Green Theory, opened in April. I have some partners that run the day-to-day over there. And then have a second retail license for a company called Botanic, which we were just talking about, opening up a, as DC calls it, a safe use consumption space, aka a lounge. And then District Canna Concepts came about because we expected to have a lot more colleagues at this point. I feel like DC's been moving a little bit slow and there hasn't been a ton of resource sharing. So we started DCC to get back to other license holders or people that are involved in the greater DMV community on the grow side, just to bring a little bit more continuity to the space and get people pulling in the same direction.
Yeah, how was the how was that licensing phase in the city? Because they had, I guess, what round are you on now? The second or third?
So they finished the last one in July. So they had the existing license holders go first, probably 2 years ago almost at this point.
Yeah.
And then I think they had, a social equity round,
Yep.
the unlicensed operator round, which was for I-71 for the most part, or supposed to be. And then you had another social equity round and then the standard one in July. I don't know. I think other people that I know have more complaints with the city in terms of how the licensure process went. The first one, it took us a couple months, ton of paperwork, didn't really know what we were doing. And then the second application we put in, I think, took like 3 days. So it was really just paperwork. But yeah, somebody at the city one thing, you get one answer. You ask somebody else another thing, and you get another one. But I think I'm lucky in the sense that most of my businesses are on the retail side. Cultivators, manufacturers are having a much harder time finding real estate, working with the Department of Buildings to actually educate them on what a cannabis facility should be built to code. I know a guy that has a license that flew an engineer in from Michigan to tell Department of Buildings how it should operate.
That's typically how it goes in damn near every state that goes into regulation. The people that's making the regulation don't know what they regulate or how it should look. And then they have people that's trying to get licensed jumping through hoops that aren't necessary, or just not being able to answer questions, like you say, like when it come down to zoning and stuff like that.
Not even just zoning. Like, we had our first security inspection, and we went to a couple different town halls and CBA meetings and stuff that the city put on. And we didn't want to build like a closed lobby, like a closed holding area. Because we wanted to be a little bit more open concept. And we're told we didn't need it. We just needed to have some sort of section at the front where people check in. They're told to wait, and then they get brought back. Get our first security inspection. Security inspector from the city walks in, and he goes, "Where's your divider wall?" So we got pushed back a month. Had to spend a couple more grand on getting another piece built. And for 2 months, we had been working off. Not thinking we had to do that.
And nobody told you that y'all couldn't, or you would, like, how you try to get the answer to say that you could or couldn't keep it open.
I asked the head of APCA at a meeting, and to nobody's credit or discredit, the airplane in DC is still being assembled as it's being launched. So a lot of the legislation around it just doesn't exist. And we don't need to get into this rabbit hole now, but a couple weeks ago there was a big medical grower that shipped a bunch of vapes, and so they had MCT oil in the packaging. Whether it was a packaging error or not, I called APCA. Appreciate you. I've been looking forward to this, bro.
Yeah, bro.
And he's like, well, is this like a whistleblower situation? And I reached out to the lab, because that's another thing I don't think people realize about DC Medical. Is like the growers have been testing their own stuff. Mm-hmm. And now you've got a lab getting spun up, so I called the guy that owns that, and I was like, can you send me the banned additives list? And he's like, there actually isn't one. So I called ABCA, and I was like, actually, this isn't a whistleblower situation, because even if I wanted it to be, you couldn't enforce this anyway.
Because you don't even have a standard of what is and isn't supposed to be in the products.
Crazy, right?
Yeah.
So that started a conversation of, okay, well, what do you think shouldn't be in here? And so they had me as a license holder do some research and send it to them, and I'm sure they're going to expand on it and add things and tweak things, but I thought that was interesting. And like Rel and I were talking, the people that are writing legislation, for the most part, seem like fine people, but they don't come from the angle of an operator or really a consumer. They come at it from an angle of what they are, which is a regulator. And so that's why I feel like when you get some of these policies that roll out, and people in the community and the culture in the industry are like, not only does this not sound right, like this is going to stop me from making money, which is a hard thing. And I was listening to a podcast yesterday, actually, and it was called Weed is Booming, so why is nobody making any money? And it went into how high your taxes are and how overregulated it is.
Man. There's a lot of barriers for people to actually make money. But that goes back to people being active on how they want the legislations to be written, and not just sitting on their ass waiting for somebody to approve something and then complain about it. Mm-hmm. It only be with so many people really blazing the trail as far as like talking to the policymakers and whatnot. So if the public put more of an effort into saying what they wanted or how they wanted it, maybe I'm not gonna say we for sure will get different results, but right now it's not working.
Do you think the public needs more input, or do you think operators need more input?
Well, both, because the operators have to deal with the legislation that the regulators make, or the policymakers make, but the public is the ones responsible for forcing the policymakers to write it a certain way. So
that's true.
Everybody got to kind of work together. Like, if the public forced them to write certain, like Maryland's bill, we ain't got it the best, but it kept getting rejected over time. It kept getting rewrote until it eventually got to a certain point. It was another state, I want to say, one of the states up north. I want to say Massachusetts, but it might not be. It's one of those other states up north. I know Oklahoma did it for sure. They kept rejecting the bill because it wasn't the way they wanted it to be. That's them putting pressure on the legislators saying that, well, if y'all want the money, we want to be able to have home grow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The industry itself is kind of like the same. Like the MCAs, the ABCDAs, they're just enforcing the rule of law, but they don't know what the hell is going on either. So y'all have to educate them on, I guess, how the industry should be run. It gotta be a flowing relationship.
You gotta have a balance for sure.
Yeah.
And part of it is, prohibition hurts everybody. Just period. And so it hurts people from a knowledge perspective, an access perspective, an access to capital perspective. And I guess why I asked about like the operator versus the consumer piece is like what's happening in Florida. There's not a ton of operators. The operators are the ones, so it's alleged, that are investing $100 million to essentially create a moat around themselves, and then create immunity for themselves. But I'm sure most consumers in Florida are like, hell yeah, like let's get recreational pot. They don't really know what's going on that side.
They don't know.
And so I think that's the balance, and you'll see. I talked about this a little bit at DC Startup Week last week, which shout out Colin over at Upling and all the people that put on. That was a really dope event to get cannabis. I feel like kind of brought into it.
How was that?
It was cool. It was really cool. that's always been kind of my background. Like I come from business and come from entrepreneurship, and so that type of environment is something I've always been comfortable in, and that's how I've worked. Is you get a bunch of people in the room, and you just talk, and that's just networking, and that's what we did at that happy hour a month or so ago.
The mixer you did.
And it and like what people like Jay Mills have been putting on for years. It's anything that brings more eyeballs to the space, anything that brings more attention. And anytime I talk, I guess for context for the audience, I'm in DC. That's where all of my business is. So any of my opinions are pretty DC focused when it comes to that. But it brought it into the mainstream a little bit, I felt like. I mean, the other panelists the rest of the week were AI, finance, tech,
it was people
pharma,
from all over the place.
people from all over. And I thought it was really cool to not only have like other colleagues in the industry there, but to see a lot of non-cannabis people like come up from the rest of the conference and be like, I thought this was going to be like a stoner hangout, and this was the most engaging audience. This was the most passionate panelist. It was the most obviously important to the people that were talking about it. And so that I feel like pretty good connection here between influential people with money.
Yeah.
The operators in the space largely are not the same people.
No.
To be candid. And so getting that group of diverse people together was a big win.
That's a big win.
Yeah, a big win. And there was like 20 other panelists, so it wasn't like a as cool as it was and like a little personal win to have like a speaking slot. It was just really cool to have that many people there talking about weed openly.
How many years have they been doing that one? This not the first year they did the...
I want to say it's like the 8th DC Startup Week, but this was the first time there's been a cannabis subject. And so Colin Frazier at Upling entered and won the pitch competition last year. So any business. And so he turned around and was like, well, I'm glad that I won this. Can we add a cannabis subject line to the next one?
That's dope. Shout out to Colin.
Big shout out to Colin. And his story's awesome. Like there was a lot of people that if you know Colin's story or if you look it up and see it, like it's really moving and powerful, and was incarcerated for the plant and then really made something different out of it and helping his mom, and really took a kind of a medicinal angle to it after he got out. And cannabis, I feel like as an industry is unique in that you don't get all of that story pretty much in any other industry. And I think one of actually the other panelists with me, Allison Siegel from Colta in Maryland, after he told his story, she paused and looked at the audience and was like, where else in DC Startup Week are you going to hear that?
Right.
So it was cool too. Cool to bring it more into the mainstream, cool to have a platform to talk about it, and then also cool for people to have a platform to tell their story.
Yeah, that's dope, man. That's dope. That mixer you did after the PBC conference was dope too.
Thanks, man.
A lot of diverse people from there.
I'm glad that it that worked out the way it did. I hope it felt like it was put together for everybody that came. It came together in probably like a week and a half, and we put it on last minute. But going back to when I first started to like look at DC from a cannabis perspective was a couple years ago. My girlfriend and partner Kat has a long history in her family of bakeries and restaurants and businesses like that. And I-71 at that point was just a word, really. Like I-71 really evolved into adult use recreational sales. Like there was no gifting, and there used to be. Like when I first was buying I-71 when I first moved up here, because I don't think the city has done a really good job of advertising their medical program. I went to Wash Hydro and I got a shirt in exchange for an eighth or whatever it was, and then over time, right, the guise was off. Like people were just openly selling weed. And so we were like, we could use this model to bring an Amsterdam cafe to DC, because then the gifting exchange would be something tangible. Like if you wanted to buy a coffee, you could get a J. Or if you wanted to buy a J, you could get a breakfast sandwich. And it would give people a reason to stay. Because cannabis is largely transactional unless like you're going and hanging out at your plug's house or you're spending a lot of time in a dispensary for some reason. You go in, you buy your product, and you leave.
It's very true.
And so there's no real reason in a traditional dispensary setting for people to stay there for very long. And so we approached an attorney with that idea, and he's like, it's a great concept, but let me tell you what's going on with the license expansion. So that was probably 2 years ago. And it was 6 months before the license window opened that we could apply for. And so we kind of caught wind of what was happening. We're like, well, we don't want to invest time or money into the I-71 route, so we just went full bore into the medical route, and then didn't really have the know-how or the understanding of the market to go like running a food and beverage program and a cafe and a dispensary. So with the partners that we founded Green Theory with, went simple, pure, clean dispensary concept like you've probably seen in a lot of places, and really nicely done. But I think one of DC's big differentiators is consumption. And I think as many things have question marks around them in DC, the consumption laws are really cool, truthfully. And I talked to the head of ABCA about
now that nobody even really questions cannabis smells or consumptions anyway.
I mean, people do question it, and that's one of the things I feel like people need to realize when you're going you're going to med, you're going into business with the city. And so we did get a lot of pushback in our like neighborhood council vote that was part of the process about consumption, and people were super scared about pre-rolls. So like easily
access.
Whatever the word would be, easily consumable products. They were worried about people leaving the shop and immediately sparking it up. So we had to have that conversation with the neighborhood, which is fine, and like the neighborhoods deserve to ask that. But that's the cool thing about consumption, is it kind of gets rid of that problem.
Is that and that's like neighborhood to neighborhood, location based, or is that citywide pushback?
I mean, I think if you ask most people if they would mind having cannabis smelling in their neighborhood, they probably would say they would not prefer that. But the way that the licensure process works is after you submit all your information to ABCA, you get a conditional license, and they say everything looks good so far. You have a year to execute. So they say you have a year to go get a lease. You have a year to submit your security plan and just build the business, essentially. And one of the last parts of the process is you get your placard from the city, which, like, if you've seen a bar, typically in DC, it's like a big orange sign in the window when their liquor license is up for renewal. You've probably seen blue ones around the city.
They just
those are people converting.
Well, they're enforcing the placard phase now.
Yeah. So during that placard phase, the neighborhood council of whatever ward your shop is in has a 45-day comment period. So anybody in the neighborhood can comment and come to the neighborhood council meetings and say, what's your security plan? Do you have security? And so we met with the heads of every private school in the Palisades. We met with the Palisades Community Association. We met with the ANC 2 or 3 times, like on public live Zooms. And it truly got ripped apart. People questioned why we got into it, and part of my kind of why with cannabis is my mom passed from breast cancer when I was 16.
Sorry.
And appreciate it. But she grew up Catholic. I went to Catholic school, kindergarten through 12th. And she just was very anti-drug, very anti-drinking before 21. My dad is a hippie on the other hand, so it was kind of a funny clash of parenting styles there. But my neighbor actually had cancer after my mom passed, and I mowed his yard for money. And I met him, and he was like, did your mom ever try cannabis? And I was like, no, not at all. And he was like, well, I'm working at Emory University with the oncology unit, teaching their cancer patients how to use cannabis.
Oh, shit.
So I was probably like 16 at the time, and I'd never smoked. And so my first introduction to just cannabis as a concept was people using it medicinally.
Medicine, yeah.
And the Catholic guilt in my mom being like, but it's also a drug and it's super bad. So I was like, this is kind of strange.
Yeah.
And so then got to college and started smoking all the time, and it's been part of my life since then.
Did you try to introduce? How far did he take it when you found out that the guy worked at the school? Did he ever bring any of this shit home?
I don't know.
Oh.
I don't know. That should have been my next question, but I wasn't smoking at the time.
Right.
So I bet you that to me is, to switch topics heavy, on the home grow conversation we were having.
Yeah.
That guy should be able to grow flower in his backyard if it makes him feel better.
You should be able to.
And so I think that's an access conversation too. Because regardless of what happens with legalization, if you aren't allowed, or you could still be incarcerated for growing this at your home,
That's New Jersey.
then that's not actually access.
That's New Jersey. New Jersey don't have home grow. It's all rec, but they can't grow. They're still locked.
Not anything?
It's recreational, but they don't have home grow. It's still illegal to grow.
That's what I'm saying. You can't grow anything?
Nah, not even with a medical card. And Pennsylvania's trying to write it to where you can only grow if you have a medical card, which I don't like either.
It's so confusing.
Yeah.
It's so confusing.
And then we was just talking about Florida, where they're full rec, nobody else can get a license, or nobody can home grow. Just come, hurry up and buy. So, like, that's why you gotta fact check the bills and, you know what I'm saying, be active per se, because they don't necessarily with politics and everything now. It's not fact based, so nobody's really saying like what's actually going on and what they are for and what they're not for.
That's really well said.
You know what I'm saying? It's just like trend based, so it's like commercials.
It is commercials.
You know, so you gotta look at that stuff, and you gotta be on them and check them to make sure that what goes forward is something that is gonna benefit you, and not just get caught up in the cool pitch and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So home grow is very important, man. And like we was talking about earlier, just because people have access to the plant doesn't mean that they're not going to still be people that consume and go to the dispensaries or frequent.
Hell no.
The you know what I'm saying, the easy access or whatever. Damn.
No, it's like, it's just capitalism. Truthfully.
Yeah.
Like, it's just, that's what I think, one of the things from like the DCC perspective and like the brand studio perspective or consulting, whatever we want to call it, is that the people that have access to licenses feel like they have the only ticket like into it, and so they want to protect it, and that's just business. And so I think a lot of cannabis operators don't know what's coming from like a cutthroat business perspective.
Yeah.
And then where the cutthroat business perspective and seeing the plant as a commodity. Or I was at a wedding 2 weeks ago, and I was talking to somebody who's works like a tech startup and works for MSOs, and the company's valued at like $30 million, and we were talking to him, and it was absolutely cutthroat. He's like, it's a crop. It's just a crop, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and that's just what's coming. And so I think people need to remember that when they're talking about legislation or when they're talking about access to the plant. Nobody grows tobacco, really.
Yeah.
You know?
Consume it, but they're not going to grow it in their backyard.
Because it's super tightly controlled and it's super regulated, and why would you, you know? And so that could be an outcome for cannabis. So I think right now is a really important time for people in the industry, or for people that have just been, cannabis has been a big part of their life, or it's their livelihood and it's what they do.
Yeah.
You need to realize that however cutthroat and nasty like trapping or selling product has been, business is just as nasty in a whole different sense.
Yes, it is.
And you got eyeballs on you, you know? So I think there's going to be rub between like the intersection of business and cannabis. And so that was the whole kind of backstory of DCC was we want to exist in the middle of that and be able to talk to people about taking dabs and be able to talk to people about a pitch deck and a business plan and help bridge the gap between the people that do care a lot about it and should have licenses and should have access to it for the right reasons, and the people that are looking at it like it's a crop and they're going to squeeze everything they can out of it.
Helping prepare people for what's coming and giving them a chance to fight the battle, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
But then we're going to take a quick break real quick with my man Robbie, and we'll be right back on the Rap Road Pod with your boy Buck.